It was a warm summer evening, and Paul felt a sense of happiness and relief. He had just finished his exams, and his college days were over. Now, it was time for a new chapter in his life. He needed a job, and he dreamed of becoming a writer, maybe even working for a newspaper. But before diving into all the responsibilities of adulthood, he decided he needed a break. After all, life had been stressful with exams and deadlines. Inside his small home, it was very hot. The heat was unbearable, and there was no breeze to cool him down. "I'll go for a walk," Paul thought to himself. "I'll take a walk down to the river and get some fresh air." Paul lived in a small town surrounded by nature, so it didn't take him long to be out in the countryside. He walked near the river, enjoying the sight of the waterbirds swimming and flying above. The peace of the moment calmed him. As he continued walking along the riverbank, something caught his eye. A young girl was standing alone by the water, gazing into it as if lost in thought. She was beautiful, with long dark hair flowing down her back, and she wore a lovely white dress that shimmered under the soft glow of the setting sun. Paul felt drawn to her. Curiosity took over, and he decided to approach her. "Hello," Paul greeted her, smiling warmly. "What's your name?" "I'm Maria," she replied softly, returning the smile. They began talking, and before they knew it, hours had passed. The sun began to set, and the sky turned dark. Maria sighed. "I must go home now," she said. "Where do you live?" Paul asked. "In the big white house on the hill," she answered. Paul smiled and said, "I live in the little brown house near the market." They both laughed, but inside, Paul felt a little sad. He couldn't help but think that Maria lived in a grand house, far away from his humble, small one. Maria came from a rich family, and Paul, well, he was just an ordinary young man. But despite their differences, Paul found himself falling in love with her. From then on, Paul and Maria met often by the river. Maria always looked beautiful, dressed in fine clothes. Paul couldn't stop thinking about her. Day and night, he wrote poems about her, pouring all his feelings into the words. One evening, he decided to share one of his poems with her. "Maria, listen," Paul said. "I've written a poem about you." He pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket and read it aloud. "I met her in the evening by the riverside. Her dress was creamy white, and her hair with ribbon tied. She turned and smiled at me, and I asked her for her name. Though I am young and poor, my love will stay the same." Maria looked at Paul with admiration. "You are wonderful, Paul," she said. "I love your poem." Feeling overjoyed, Paul took her hand gently in his and looked into her eyes. "I love you, Maria," he said. "Do you love me?" Maria smiled warmly and said, "Yes, of course. I love you," feeling as though his heart would burst with happiness. Paul said, "Then, will you marry me?" His voice was full of hope. "Say yes, Maria. We'll be happy together." Maria stood up. "I must go home now," she said. Before walking away, Paul stood there, frozen with happiness. She loves me, he thought to himself. She really loves me. When Paul got home, he was still smiling, his heart full of joy. He lived with his mother in their little brown house. It wasn't much, but they made it work. His father had passed away when he was young, and his mother had always been there for him. His mother noticed his excitement. "What's happened, Paul?" she asked. "Why are you so happy?" "It's nothing, Mother," Paul replied, trying to hide his big smile. But his mother knew better. She smiled to herself and thought, "He's in love." The next day, Paul and Maria met again by the river. But this time, Maria didn't seem her usual self. She looked sad, and Paul didn't notice at first. He took her hand, excited to tell her more about his dreams. "Maria, I'm poor now, but one day, I'll be a famous writer," Paul said, with a spark of ambition in his eyes. "Will you marry me, Maria? Say yes." Maria didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked down, tears welling up in her eyes. Slowly, she shook her head, turned, and ran away. Paul stood there in shock. He didn't understand. "Maria, why?" he thought, feeling his heart break. "Doesn't she love me?" He went home slowly, feeling confused and upset. "What's wrong? She loves me, doesn't she?" he thought. That evening, after dinner, a servant from the house on the hill came to the door. "I'm from the house on the hill," the servant said. "My mistress would like to see Paul." "That's me," Paul said, surprised but eager. Maybe Maria had changed her mind. The servant led Paul up to the house, and Paul's heart raced with anticipation. "Maybe she wants to marry me after all," he thought. When they arrived, Paul entered the grand house. Everything inside was beautiful and expensive. The carpets were soft, and the paintings on the walls were stunning. Paul looked at himself in a mirror and realized just how out of place he felt. In a grand room, an old woman sat in a large chair, and Maria stood behind her. The old woman looked proud. With a cold, hard expression, her hands were covered with large rings. "So, you want to marry my daughter?" the old woman said in a cold voice. "Yes," Paul said bravely. "I love Maria, and I want to marry her." The old woman laughed. "You? A poor student with nothing? My daughter will never marry you." Paul stayed calm. "I may be poor now," he said, "but one day, I will be a famous writer." "No," the old woman said with a cruel smile. "My daughter is going to marry someone else. You will never see her again." Paul looked at Maria, hoping for some sign, but she didn't meet his gaze. She seemed distant. The old woman left the room, and Maria and Paul were left alone. Paul went to Maria, hoping to talk things through, but she stepped back. "I'm sorry, Paul," she said quietly. "I can't marry you. I want money, luxury, and a comfortable life. I don't want to be poor." Paul couldn't believe what he was hearing. "But Maria, I love you," he said. Maria sighed. "I love you, Paul," she said. "But love isn't enough. I'm getting married in 2 weeks." Paul walked away, heartbroken. He ran down the hill to the river, trying to understand what had happened. Maria loves me, he thought, but she's marrying someone else for money. When he got home, his mother was waiting for him. She saw the sadness in his eyes. "They are bad people, my son," she said. "You must forget her.